If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know I'm working on a Framer Motion course, and today I want to give you a sneak peek at the very first lesson. Hope you enjoy. Welcome to lesson 1 of the course, and in this video we're going to be adding some animation to this multi-step form. We're going to be going through some of the most basic APIs that Framer Motion gives us and see just how far they get us in really improving the user experience of this form. And to do so, we're going to be looking at the native Mac application Things for some inspiration. So if we take a look at Things and we check off one of these to-dos, we'll see we have some nice background color animation. The check actually animates if you look close enough. And there's this kind of glow and scale effect as well. And overall, these effects just make for a very satisfying click when you check off one of those to-dos. Now, we don't quite have checkboxes here, but these steps are close enough. And we're going to see how we can use the effects from the Things app as inspiration for our demo so we don't have to start off with a blank slate. So let's take a quick look at this demo. We can just click continue or back to go through these steps, which are controlled with some React state. We pass the current step in to each one of these components. The rest of this is really just static except for these two buttons, which increase and decrease the step. And then this step component, which represents these circles right here, has 3 different states, and this is where we're going to be doing all of our animation. So we can see a step can be inactive, active, or complete. And this project is styled using Tailwind, so we can see we're just conditionally applying some Tailwind classes, but everything we're going to learn applies no matter what approach you use to styling your app. Okay, so to start, let's just add some basic animation for the background color of these checks. We want to be able to click this and see this kind of fade into blue instead of just flip over like it does now. And we can see right now, all of this is controlled right here. So when we go from active with a background white, and then we click next, we get to a status of complete with a background of blue 500. So this is the element that we want to animate with Framer Motion. And to do that, we're first going to come up to the element and turn it into a motion element using the motion import from Framer Motion. So we can grab this, import motion from Framer Motion. So now if we come back to our motion element and we make sure to save this and refresh and take a look, we're going to see our app behaves exactly as before. And this is because motion elements are actually a superset of React elements. So they support all the same props and behavior that normal React elements do. But they also give us additional props we can use to animate them. And the first one we want to look at is the animate prop. So the animate prop takes in any CSS property, like opacity, for example, that you would normally pass into the style prop, but it lets us animate it. And so if we were to save that, well, we see all of our steps there fade out. And if we put in 1, they fade back in. So that's kind of cool. Even with just hot reloading and saving our code, we can already see Framer Motion is applying these animations. But we don't want to have to save the code to change the opacity, right? Or the style of our div. We actually want to do that based on the status. So we already have the status in this variable, which changes as we click forward and back. So what if we did something like, if the status is complete, let's make it 0. Otherwise, let's make the opacity 1. And now as we click through, it's kind of silly, but you get the idea. This is the basic way to do state-based animation with Framer Motion. And we can see just how easy it is. Framer Motion knows to respond to React state changes. And so you can see how well this aligns with the React paradigm. But we don't want to animate the opacity here. We want to animate the background color from white to blue. So instead of opacity, let's make this background color. And if we're complete, we'll want to use this hex color right here, which is our blue. Otherwise, we'll want to use white, which is FFF. So if we come over, reload, and try this out, look at that. We've got the fading background just like that. Now, the way Framer Motion works is by using JavaScript to animate our elements. And so we can't actually reuse these classes that we were using previously to style our app, which is why we had to put hex colors in here. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not a native hex speaker. So usually in my projects, I like to output all of the colors that I'm using, with Tailwind, or if I was using another design system, into CSS variables, because Framer Motion can use CSS variables to do its animations. So I already have that wired up, and that means I can just switch this out with blue 500, and I can switch this out with white. And now I can save this. And as we continue, this is going to be a lot easier to work with. So you can take a look at that in the code, but I definitely recommend using CSS variables if you have design tokens like this. Okay, if we take a look, this looks pretty good so far, but we'll see our border is not currently animating. It just kind of flips over. So let's bring that up into our animate prop right here. And we'll just do that with border color. And we'll see the inactive has the gray or the slate 200 border color. Otherwise, it's going to be blue on active and on complete. So basically, if we're complete or status is active, we want the blue 500. Otherwise, we want slate 200. And now we can see those changes. And when we click this, it looks like it's fading pretty nicely. Now, sometimes when I'm working on an animation, especially early on, it can be hard to exactly see that I've got everything wired up correctly. And we can see that the border's changing, but it's pretty subtle. So one thing we can do is use another prop that Motion Elements give us, which is called the transition prop. And this is a prop we can use to basically customize a transition that our animation uses. And there's a bunch of really cool props here. We'll learn about some more of these in a little bit. But the main one that I like to use right now is the duration. And this is going to basically give us a longer duration. This is in seconds, so this is going to take a second. Now, if we click continue, we can see very clearly that both our background and our border are transitioning, but our text color is not. So this is handy to increase the duration of your animation, especially when you're starting out with a new one. So let's go ahead and bring over that text color. We'll grab this because it looks like it goes to blue 500 once it's active, and then it swaps out with a check incomplete. But when it's inactive, if we take a look at our classes, we'll see that it actually uses slate 400, a little bit darker shade of slate, and that looks pretty nice. So now when we click, it looks like we have a smooth transition on all of the colors going from inactive to active and the background going to complete. And now that we have all the states covered in Framer Motion, we can go ahead and delete all of these conditional classes from our CSS. And that's going to work for us just perfectly. Okay, let's come back to our app and take a look at the initial render. So if I refresh this, now that we've refactored from CSS to Framer Motion, the initial render looks a little funny. And this is because Framer Motion doesn't really have a starting point for these animations when they first get mounted by React. Well, there's another prop called initial, which we can use to do just that. And this takes all the same attributes as animate. So we could do something like background color is var black. And once it's rendered, we see all the same behavior. But if we refresh, look, it goes from black to the current state. But we don't actually want to have any mount animations in this case. When you first load this page, it should just render the card in the state that it's in. There are some cases where you do want to animate elements on mount, but in this case, we don't want to. So if we take a look over at the tooltip here, we'll see it actually says that we can set it to false to initialize with the values in animate, disabling the mount animation. So if we remove all of this and instead of passing an object of styles, we just pass false, then we can come over, refresh, and look at that. That's going to be exactly what we want for this. It starts off static, and then once we continue through, we see our animations are taking effect. So that's an easy way to disable the mount animations. Now, if we take a look at the current state of our code, and let's go ahead, comment out this transition prop and just kind of see how this feels. We can already see this is adding a little bit of life to this kind of multi-step wizard here. We've kind of made a little bit of a mess here, right? It's a little bit hard to read all the work that we've done because If I were to ask you what happens if one of these steps goes from an inactive state right here to an active state, and I were to say, okay, what actually happens to the styles? How are they animated? Just by looking at this code, it's actually quite difficult to tell because these are broken down by CSS property. And if you were to tease apart what each one of those would be in different states, it's basically impossible to read. And so this kind of code style for coding animations in Framer Motion can get pretty complex pretty quick. But fortunately, Framer Motion has another feature for us that will help us clean this right up, and it's called variants. So the way variants works, it's another prop to motion elements. And instead of passing in CSS properties as the keys, we actually pass in the state of our component as the object keys. And so we can do that. We know we have inactive, active, and complete. And now under each one of these, we can actually put in all of our CSS styles that we want to animate. So let's start with the background color. And we know that the background color is blue incomplete, right? So we can say var blue 500. And every other time, it should be white. So we can grab this, and now we can move on to border color. When we're complete and active, we want this to be blue 500. And when we're inactive, we want this to be slate 200. And finally, the color should be slate 400 for inactive, blue 500 for active, and blue 500 for complete. So we basically kind of flipped this object here, and now that we have this, the way we actually tell Framer Motion which variant should be currently rendered is just by passing in a string for the current variant into animate. Well, we already have a variable here called status, which has the current variant, so let's just pass that in like this, hit save, and let's come over, give this a refresh, and we see all of our animations are working just like before. But now, if we look at our code, hopefully you agree this is much easier to read. Now we can see exactly what happens when we go from an inactive to an active state just by looking at our code. The background color stays white, the border color goes from slate 200 to blue 500, and the color here changes to blue 500 from slate 400. So basically for any non-trivial animation, I end up extracting the variants pretty quickly. And hopefully, you can agree here that this is much nicer to read and it's easier to tweak and change as we add more complexity to our animations. Now, one thing I really like about the things animation is how the check mark draws itself whenever you click on a to-do. Pretty cool, right? Before using Framer Motion, I wouldn't have even guessed how to do this, but it's so easy to do, so this is one of my favorite parts. Let's go ahead and do the same thing to our demo and make it so whenever we click, this path draws itself. And we'll see right here, we're rendering this check icon when the status is complete. So that's when this thing first appears. And if we scroll down, we'll see the check icon is just an SVG with this one path. Well, it turns out you can make SVG elements into motion elements just the same as with normal HTML elements. So if we make this a motion.path and we check this out, we're going to see the same thing. But now, if we add the animate prop, there is a special property called path length, which can go from 0 to 1. And if you weren't looking, you can see as I change this, let's go ahead and make the transition a duration of 2. And check this out, when I go from 0 to 1, it draws out the check. I mean, how cool is that? It's so easy to do. And yeah, this is one of the reasons I love this library. So if we wanted to actually animate this, once we click, what should we do? Well, we want it to end up at a path length of 1. And we already know that we can add a mount animation when the check icon is first rendered by using the initial prop. So let's just copy this, set initial to 0, and give this a shot. Pretty cool. We can kind of see it working. Let's slow this down a little bit. And yeah, it's working great. It's just that this background is kind of hiding it when it first runs. So we've got our check animating, but let's start tweaking the transitions here to make this a little bit more pleasant. Let's come up to our background, and I think it's taking just a little bit too long, and I think the default transition for these background colors here is like 0.3 seconds. Let's go ahead and throw the transition back in, and we'll just play with this. So 0.3 kind of looks to be about the same, maybe a little faster. Let's try 0.2. Yeah, I think that's a good start. And let's come back down to our check. And one thing we can do, another property that we have available to us here, is the delay. So again, if we look at kind of the default transition here, we just miss a lot of the check animation because it starts while the background is fading in. So let's put a delay on this animation, and we'll start with 0.2 seconds here. And so now we kind of get this pretty neat effect where we see the full check animation. Now, another property that's going to have a big impact on how your animations look is the type property. And you can see here, this can take these different values. You've probably heard about spring animations. They work really well for certain kinds of things. But in our case, I want to take a look at this tween animation, which is going to let us set another property here called ease. And if we come down and choose ease out, we'll see that our check mark kind of slows down at the end. And let's also set the duration here. Let's try 0.3. And let's take a look at this. It's kind of a nice little, check mark like animation. If you were drawing out a check, you would kind of imagine it easing in towards the end here. So there's something kind of nice about that. And I like how this is turning out so far. Playing with transitions is one of the funnest parts of doing any animation, and there's a lot of cool little helper methods and shortcuts on this transition object. Definitely encourage you to check out the API and just go wild in your own examples because it's a lot of fun. But this is looking pretty good. Let's go back to things, and if we look at the completion of a to-do and really take a look at this, the last big part of this is this kind of glow and scale effect. The glow in the background has this kind of ripple effect that is really nice. So let's take a look at how we might build that here. And I think the way I would do this is to just basically make kind of a new div right behind our circle right now. And we can use absolute positioning so that it takes up the same amount of space. And then we can just scale it up so that it appears behind this div. So to do this, let's wrap this whole div kind of in a new div. We'll make this class name a relative. So this is going to be a position relative. And that means we should be able to do something like an absolute positioned div right here with inset 0. Let's just give this background green of 500. And there we go. We can see kind of we have our new div. But it's appearing on top because it is absolutely positioned. So I think if we just add a relative position to this, this will kind of put this div in the same stacking context. And because it appears after in the DOM, it will naturally just render on top of it. And that's exactly what we want. So let's make this rounded full. And instead of green, let's just do that so we can see this. Let's use something like blue 200 so that it's kind of a light shade. And now it's sitting perfectly behind our steps. But if we were to do something like scale to 125, that's going to give us a nice little glow effect. So instead of using CSS to scale this up, we're going to use Framer Motion. So same thing, let's turn this into a motion.div, and let's add an animate prop. And if we try scale 1.25, there we go. We can see it scaling up and down. So that's pretty cool. Now we're going to do the same thing down here. We're going to use variance. So for animate, we're going to pass in the status, and then we'll define some variance. In our case, we only want the glow to show up once we complete the actual step. So we can define a complete variant here for scale 1.25, and then right before it's complete, it's active So we'll make that a scale of 1. Now, if we come over here, look at that. That's pretty cool. And if we go back, it kind of undoes itself. That's pretty neat. And in things, this kind of fades out. So maybe when we're active, the glow is opacity 1. And when we're complete, it's opacity 0. It's going a little bit fast. Let's go ahead and say transition. Maybe duration is like 0.5. That's pretty neat. You can see the kind of ripple. And maybe actually we want to delay this because the check being drawn is delayed too. And now when the check gets drawn, it kind of has this ripple effect. So that's kind of it's a pretty simple, easy way to achieve this glow. Now, I actually liked it when we didn't have the opacity. So if we remove the opacity, there's something kind of fun about this. It almost seems like each step is being activated. And if we come and finesse this a little bit more, let's use type tween. And then for ease, we'll go down to circ out, which is an even more aggressive ease, basically. And let's take a look at what this looks like. It kind of makes the glow settle. And we can even increase this maybe to 0.6. And I just think there's something really satisfying about that. So the check kind of gets drawn, and then the glow kind of expands out. So that's pretty neat. Now, before we wrap up, you'll see as I go back, framer motion is kind of animating between these states. And so we actually see our ripple here is being delayed because we have a delay on the transition right here. And that makes sense when we're kind of moving forward, right? The check is being drawn and then the ripple comes out with it. But on the way back, it feels a little bit off, feels a little silly. So it'd be nice if we could change the duration here for a specific variant. Well, turns out we can. We can actually put variant specific transitions nested within the variant definitions themselves. So let's say on the way back to active, whenever we basically enter the active state, we don't want any delay and we want the duration to be a little bit faster. So we can make it 0.3 instead of 0.6. And now if we save this, take a look. We've got the nice kind of heavy feel going forward. But if we go back, look at that. It's pretty neat. We could even make this 0.2. And that's pretty nice. So it's pretty cool. You can nest anything that you would put into transition here within specific variant definitions. Needless to say, you can go pretty wild with this stuff. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention is you might have thought, hey, every time we add a new motion element, we need to reproduce this kind of animate equals current status property here. And wouldn't it be nice if we could share these? Because both of them are conceptually in the same state. Well, turns out we can. If we come up and make the parent a motion.div and we move animate equals status right here on the parent, we can see everything still works. But if we delete it from the glow and we delete it from the background, give this a refresh, we're going to see everything works just as expected. So this is just another neat feature of using variants. You are able to define the current variant on a parent and all children motion elements will inherit that. So that means they all just have to define their own variants and what it means for them to be in each state, as opposed to having to worry about setting the current state and having those mismatch. It's just another really nice aspect of working with variants, keeps your code declarative, and lets framer motion take care of animating between all these different states. Even if you press quick or you cancel one of them, framer motion is going to take care of all of that, which is one of the reasons why it's so fun and easy to animate with this library. Okay, so that is it for this first lesson. Just to recap, to use an animation, you turn an element into a motion element. You can pass in an object with CSS properties to the animate prop, or you can use a variant and define it like we saw here. And you also have this transition prop, which you can use to really customize the look and feel of your animations. So if we come over here, we can take a look at what we started with, which is something you probably see in an app you're working on right now. And if we look at what we ended up with, we can see this is pretty cool, much more satisfying to go through. You know, might nudge your users, just encourage them a little bit more to finish that and get those nice little ticks. So that is it for this lesson. You know, you really learned enough at this point that you could go play around with frame of motion in your own app, so feel free to do that. But otherwise, that wraps it up here, and I will see you in the next lesson. Well, that about wraps it up for this one. Hope you learned a thing or two about frame of motion, and if you want to stay up to date with the course, check out the link in the description below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.